All right, thank you guys so much. We have a very different and special episode today. I am joined by, I'll say, my favorite subscriber, Darren, from Australia. He has been a consistent viewer and constantly leaving comments, which has been seriously, I can't tell you how much it means to me. It really does mean a lot when you leave comments. And you left some really interesting ones, and that's why I created this channel to get some good ideas out there. So if anyone wants to talk, I'm always available. Darren, can you introduce yourself, please? Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, so I'm Darren. I live down under in Australia, and I do mastering engineering, as you might be able to guess from my YouTube handle. That's what I do for a living. And other than that, I've studied a whole heap of therapeutic and transformative change work from a very early age. Well, it all started back when I was in year three. When I was in year three, we moved back to Australia from various postings around the world, and because my parents were diplomats, and my dad happened to buy a going out of business bookstore, secondhand bookstore, and so in my house there was a secondhand bookstore,
Oh,
but um, but it went all the way up to like 1979. And then it stops. So it stopped at 1979. So I'm in the late 80s going to school, and my mother decided she'd had enough of me and my little brother, and sent us to school on the other side of the city. So we had 3 hours of public transport minimum, and if we missed a bus, it was more like 4 hours of every single day. And so from a very early age, I started reading everything. I read books on Kabbalah, and I read a lot of the stuff that was, you know, being bestsellers in that self-help realm.
mhm.
So I read things like Supernature or Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. Um, I read Carlos Castaneda's works. I read pretty voraciously because there was literally nothing else to do, no smartphones, nothing to, fire your dopamine off. And I probably read something in the order of 3,000 books between, you know, year three and end of year six, maybe more. Not sure. I read just so many, and it kind of started me down the path of wanting to understand who we are, why we exist, what our purpose is, what our capacity is, and one of the biggest problems that I had from an early age that I really wanted to resolve was, if the only way I could describe it, this is how I would articulate it at the time. If infinity, how come this specific thing, like this chair? How come that? How do I resolve the infinite and the specificity of reality? And that's functionally been resolved, which is good.
Yeah, we'll get into that. It's interesting. You said
Yeah.
3,000 books. I think when I was in year 3 to 6, I watched the same episode of Drake and Josh about 3 to 6,000 times. So there was an extreme difference between you and me there. So I think you're a little more well read than I am. Uh,
Well, I was just pushed to do that because there's literally nothing to do when you're stuck on a bus for 4 hours.
no,
Um, and and because she's sending me to the other side of town and it's primary school, there's no one else I know on the bus, and I have to get up and travel to work with all these like frowning public servants, and that's also kind of what in Canberra where I was at the time. It's like 80-90% of the people who work there are in the public service,
okay.
and so it's basically a big government city. So it's very safe, but it's very culturally not super rich.
Mhm.
And I noticed a lot of people were just not happy. They just walked around with these frowns on their faces the whole time, and I was like, I never want to be like that.
Mhm.
That doesn't look fun, and it doesn't look right to me. And so yeah, I had a lot of influence from a lot of these great thinkers very, very early on, and I put a lot of things into practice. So I there was a lot of books in there on all sorts of different spiritual practices. So I tried a lot of different meditation practices from a very early age. I remember sitting in my cupboard in a lotus position. I'd shut the cupboard and spend the whole weekend from like morning till the afternoon just meditating, doing zero, like Zen zero meditation and stopping thought. And I after I was able to like successfully just sit there in complete nothing, no thought, I thought, I don't think the translation's right because stopping thought doesn't and having zero or nothing doesn't really seem to lead to any kind of
Yeah.
high level enlightenment. I'm not sure what this enlightenment thing is. And interestingly enough, it turns out that that is actually a translation error, and that it's more like when you are in a full blown state of absolute unity consciousness, that it is incompatible with the language processing part of the mind. So having no thought is more like a symptom, not a cause. Yeah. But anyway, I jumped way forward.
No, that's right.
Anyway,
There's a
just
couple of
gives you a
things.
little,
I'm sorry, go
just
ahead.
gives you a little bit of background on where I started and what my interests have been. And I took it from an early age. I've 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 kind of narrowed in on what I do is I look for demonstrable experts in their area of in a domain. Like anything I want to learn, this is how I do it. I look for who are the absolute demonstrable experts who produce the results that are in that domain that I want to understand. And then I engage with them, and I'll engage with them. It's very easy to engage with demonstrable experts because half the time they want to tell everyone about it. They write books and things, or the other half of the time you can reach out to them and chat with them
Yeah.
because they're usually very happy to talk, and people just don't do that. And then I have this one caveat: I only take their advice on the thing that they're a demonstrable expert in. So I don't take financial advice from a like a rock star. You know what I mean? I just take rock star advice from a rock star. If that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's a lot of good stuff in there. There's a couple things that your point about wanting to avoid the frown, this sort of I don't want to live this sort of depressed life. I don't like to talk about it too much, but I'm diagnosed with clinical depression. And we had a similar thing where sort of
Right.
books and the information that they can offer you can run you from that sort of depressed, spiritually unfulfilling, just kind of brutal, I'm just getting through life day by day. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And another thing that, I hate to bring him up so quickly, but Gebser, I think with the Zen Buddhism, what I think he was saying is what they're trying to do is they're trying to regress. They seem to be the idea is suspend the ego, which of course really apotheosized during the mental
Mm.
consciousness structure because the subject object thing. They're regressing back to the unity and the magical consciousness structure. But now, whether you disagree with Gebs or not, he says that's a regression. We can't do that. We have to go forward into
Yeah.
and find that sort of.
Yeah. Well, you've got to remember that that's all written after the Buddha had died by people who are trying to understand it, who are then translating it. So there's those people that wrote it. It's Chinese whispers. Those people write that. And then along comes the human potential movement, who are just bounding out of this new psychology movement that's been mistranslated from German within the invention, instead of, because Freud said people's problems are conceived of it, and I. And the guy who translated it was like, yeah, let's not use I and it. Let's make it more obscure and academic sounding. Let's turn that into ego and id, which it never was
Oh,
in the
I
German,
see. I
right?
see.
And then the people who are bounding out of that, creating the human potential movement, are the ones who are discovering Buddhism and translating it. And so they're conflating it in all sorts of ways with all sorts of mistranslations.
That's
With people,
fascinating.
yeah, with people who are already conflating it to begin with, because they were writing about it not directly, but from indirectly hundreds of years afterwards. And so yeah, I'm not surprised Gebser says that stuff
No, yeah, and it's
because,
interesting. There's a sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, because what when you look at that human potential movement and those early practices of Buddhism and things, the idea was that you need to transcend your ego, and the ego functionally becomes this bucket of stuff that I don't like this stuff, so I'm going to fill it up with all the stuff about me I don't like, and then try and do a move called transcending that. That sounds crazy to me. Like, if you functionally try and do that internally, that's mad.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so people have kind of figured this out bit by bit. And, they've figured out that actually what you do is different techniques. And those different techniques, depending on which ones that fit with your neurology, will lead to different experiential states. And so there's mantric techniques that replace your thinking with a mantra. There's bodily presence techniques where you scan and you can do micro versions where you're scanning tiny micro parts of your body slowly, slowly. And that changes your consciousness state a certain way. There's internal states that lead to void. There's external projection states that lead to expansion. There's a whole bunch of them. And it turns out that you need to find the one that's neurologically fitted with you. And then that's the one that'll actually work.
Hmm.
And then and then once you do it for a while, you'll unlock a capacity to experience an altered state. But there's a whole array of them. And after you do it for a while and get really good at entering into that altered state, then you're probably ready to go find a different technique that will do a different state. And they all kind of end up in different endpoints, and they've all been conflated together like they're one kind of thing,
Mhm.
and they're just not.
Yeah, that's
And so,
fascinating.
yeah, and it's probably worth um, noting that from the outset that what I'm going to talk about and what I am, the place that I'm coming from, is having developed the capacity to go into unitive consciousness states that preclude the nominalization of reality that is done via language. So the linguistic aspect of the mind shuts down. It's still there, but it's only it doesn't
It's been retracted.
it, yeah, it's what it's been replaced with is an expanded awareness. So you're functional, you walk around, you can talk, but you're not experiencing separation of self and other or self in time. So it's a very and if you do an EEG of the brain when you're in that state, it lights up almost identically to people that are on high doses of psilocybin.
Hmm.
And so, but without any of the delirium involved or anything. So there's different places, and what that state does is it shows how language functions, and when language um, so the best way to explain it would be to first explain what the word is.
Sound like
So
Bill Clinton.
yeah, so here's what the word is. So um, if we get a ball, I'm sure the kids will have a ball here, right? Um, So, and this is actually one of the differences that seems to be experimentally with animals versus human beings. So you can teach an animal ball, ball, like that, but you can't teach them. You have to show the ball and say ball, and then whenever, and then they connect ball to that. But we do something else. We have the capacity to have ball and then that. We don't have to have it present to be connected to it. So what we do is we, in the back of our minds, create a representation of the ball that is attached to the word ball. And we can play around with that back there and reflect on it. And we can create, we don't just create. So when you go ball with a dog, it learns this ball. This is ball. But we go, ball, and we put it back here and we create all classes of ball and all types. So we create, anything that's ball like, and they're all represented. And so the experiment that I like to think about is you may have come across this one where there's a tribe. I think it's an African tribe, and they have many, many different words for green.
Mm.
And the green, it's actually very fortuitous that I'm wearing this. It's a very similar color green to this, and there's two shades of it that are almost identical. And if you put them in a circle wheel, so that there's like squares of all of these greens, and you put one of that one, and all of the others are a different shade. Um, and you show it to Western people who just have like, this is green. They'll go, and you ask them to spot which square is out. They'll take ages to spot it. Whereas you show that tribe and they go, oh, that's air or whatever, whatever the word, the particular word is, but they spot it like that because they've got a very specific word for it. And that's the function of what is. And so at the beginning of the Bible, when it talks about the word, God making the world, making the word and the world from the word, that's actually not that's not metaphorical. That's what we do. When you look around at the environment around you, it's all one big morass, just one big, like looking through a kaleidoscope, it's just this one big thing. And then we begin to individuate everything out using language. And so that's how I can spot this chair and this wall and these pictures, these drawings my kids have done. And we know beard and we know mum, dad, and we know all of this stuff. And that's why functionally what it lets you do is nominalize out from the background all of the individuated aspects of things. But behind that, when you experience reality directly, the directness of it is prior to and incompatible with that linguistic nominalization. But that's what the word is. And I really do believe that that's what's also being talked about. I keep finding these things in spirituality that seem like they're metaphors, but they're not actually metaphors. They're just myth. They're just more that magic and mythic linguistic way of describing the functioning of an aspect of humans inside instantiated in a world or a reality. Yeah, if that makes sense.
No, there's a lot of good stuff. It's funny. I got a bunch of points, but the last point, Gebser later on, I think the first inkling of the idea of the consciousness structure, he actually got through poetry. Um, there was,
Wow.
I know Holderlin apparently, it was not, it was the way he described it was no longer that poets would describe the world, is that the world was revealed through poetry. And of course, poetry has to do with words.
Yep.
So these little shifts. So I think that goes a lot to your point where linguistic is There's a whole lot more to it than you would think. And even just the one definition, I was going to make a point about the translation you were talking about earlier. I can sympathize a little bit why they would be mistranslated because I haven't gotten to this part of my series yet, but he makes a digression on the root words of the root meaning of words. And in the magic structure, remember everything is expressing a unity, so that includes words. But in the
Yeah,
rational mental, A must be A cannot be A and B at the same time. So the
yeah, right.
mistranslation derives from decoupling one definition from the whole host of it because you can't make sense of it with your current way. And I think that's
Yeah,
probably why it is. There's some the symbol. I think you were talking a little bit the distinction between symbol and symbolized to an extent. The sort of the
yeah,
symbol of the word, and then we have the idea of the thing itself.
yeah.
Um,
So what we do is we label something with a word, but we make it at the same time an internal representation. So that's why. So animals don't do this. So when you and you can kind of understand it because if you and I were kind of like Seinfeld like characters living in gazelle bodies and we just rocked up on this savannah and we'd been pretty naive. We've been in like the cool part of the savannah and suddenly there's these things called lions and they freaking come at us. You and I we get away with it takes down someone in the herd and we look around and the rest of the gazelles, like, it's literally like it's been like, what, 3 minutes, 2 minutes? We've gotten away. Everyone's back to eating.
mhm.
And they're just like, yeah, well, no, it doesn't exist anymore. And you and I would be looking at one another and going, bro,
Yeah,
lions,
get out of there.
what? Dude, dude, what are you doing? Just eating grass. What?
Mm.
Lions. Wow,
Yeah,
what?
yeah,
And that's because we've got the capacity to retain and represent the lion and all of its meaning and all of its implication and to think about it. So we functionally abstract out reality via first linguistically labeling it and then internally creating a mirror representation of it that is in the internal subjective. And now, I'm going to use this as a jumping off point to try and start to describe what I'm talking about, the unitive, and how it's different to what I see being fundamentally the integrative, which
yeah.
is where you were semantically pushing back on me in the comments. So I can't remember what waffle I said, but the reason that semantically it seems like what I'm saying is the same thing is because as I'm looking out and I'm seeing what I believe is the emergence of a new unconsciousness structure that is beginning to it's just starting and it's beginning to be accessible by all of humankind, but we're in a transitional phase. The reason that it looks semantically similar is because it includes everything that Gibbs is talking about. It includes all of the integral aspects, but it transcends their limitations. And so it's very similar to if you took the non-perspectival man and you said, look out at this vista. Can you not see the space? There's the trees, there's the house, the cottage, all of that you talked about. And the non-perspectival man would be like, yeah, yeah, there's the tree, there's the cottage, there's the thing. And you're like, yeah, but there's the space. And they're like, yeah, they're over there, they're over there. Nothing's changed, but everything's changed.
Right.
And he can't see the limit. Um, but there's this new perspectival aspect that's capable of opening up. But they're both looking at the same thing and they're still seeing the same features and describing the same thing. But because the new thing that's being introduced includes all of the non-perspectival, and so it
Yeah.
doesn't sound any different. But so the way you have to get to it is by looking at the limitation and then find a limitation and then begin to transcend it. And I've only just, so I must say, I'm not very good at this yet. I'm only just being able to kind of tease it out. But one of the main limitations that I see is that you, in an integral perspective, you would see the integration between the representation and the that which is labeled, and you would see them as two different perspectives that are aspectual and can be viewed from each as essentially different. They have these different perspectives and the integration between them.
Yeah.
Whereas what I'm saying is they are actually unitive in that they are both constitutive of one another. So the label and the representation and the thing itself co-arise and co-emerge together,
Can I give
and
you an
they
example?
are mutually constitutive of one another,
They condition each
and
other.
they sorry.
They condition each other.
Yeah, but they are the same. So I was playing around with how I can kind of come up with a metaphor for it. And um, so a simple principle to think about is discipline and freedom. Or another one, let's start with rights and responsibilities. And so rights and responsibilities, when you think about them, they are actually two sides of the same coin, and they arise together, and they are interlocked, and they actually constitute one another, because the so when you think about it, if you want to have certain rights, the only way those rights can principally function in a harmonious society is if you have the capacity to embody the responsibility that those rights entail. If you don't think of it that way, that's how we end up with men in women's prisons and like all sorts of things that are just not fair, because you're like, no, rights are separate.
Yeah.
And you just granted all these rights, and responsibility is something else.
Mhm.
That's can't be part of the same thing. And then when you integrate them, you do see how they're actually integrated. But what I'm saying is something different. I'm saying they're mutually constitutive, in as much as the the rights inform the responsibilities, and the capacity of the responsibilities confer the amount of rights to grow. And so they are interlocked in a harmonious, emergent way, where they cannot be, not only can they not be separated, but they are constituting one another and growing one another. They are the same emergent thing. The more responsibility that you can bear, the more rights are opening up or available to you. And the more rights that are available to you, the more responsibility that they confer on you. They are not, they are the same thing. They are unitive. It's the same as discipline and freedom. This comes from one of Stephen Covey's books, The Eighth Habit, where he says he thought that freedom and discipline were totally different things. But then he was made to go and practice the piano while his mates went bike riding. Excuse me. Just one second. And so he thought his friends had more freedom than he did, because they could do whatever they wanted. Fair enough. But then he practiced and became really good at the piano. I'm not sure if this is his story or if it's an example. I can't remember if he played the piano, but I really liked this illustration. So you sit at the piano and practice and practice, and you get to a concert pianist level. Now suddenly you have way more freedom. Those guys who are bike riding, they can sit down at the piano and they can maybe go, Mary had a little lamb. Oh, I played that wrong. Whereas you can fully express, you know, a piano concerto. You can express all range of emotion, and you can tour the world on that. So discipline and freedom are emergent qualities of the same coin, and they are constitutive of one another, and they are not just. And so the other highlighted aspect of this difference is that everything that I'm talking about cannot be known about, it must be embodied. So this unitive aspect is an embodied aspect. It's an embodied knowing. It's not just theoretical. It's the emergent aspect of the mutually constitutive seeming opposites that combine together and emerge in a real and an embodied way, not in an intellectual way. If
Not
that
just
makes
purely
sense.
abstract. It's
Yeah, yeah.
it's a combination of
It
all epistemological processes, not just mental thought when I can close my eyes and
yeah.
have.
It's not it's not just the representation and the implication, but how they expand together. And so I should go a little bit into that what meaning is thing.
I was going to ask, that was
I tell you
literally.
where it. Well, yeah, I'll tell you where it came from. It came from listening to Jordan Peterson, and he said something very funny. And I have a dialectical unconscious mind that's quite funny. It mucks around with me all the time. And so Jordan Peterson said in a throwaway comment, he said, you know, movies are like hyper real, and they're like more real than real life because they're like the real world stripped of all of its triviality, and it's just the most important stuff. And that you could make he's like, you could make the case that they're more real than real life. And I was like, wow, well, what an odd thing, what an odd concept. And I was driving around, and I was driving up. I still remember I was driving up the hill going home, and I'm like, is that really? How could you make that case? All right, let's try and make that case. What are movies though? They're just representations that because he said, you look at Dances with Wolves, and the reason you like the movie and it makes sense to you is you project yourself over the top of Kevin Costner, and you live through Kevin Costner, and you live his whole life, and it has all of this stuff. And I was like, how's that arguing for that? Anyway, so I'm driving up the hill, and I think to myself, are they though? But they're just representations. Are representations like real thing? Representations are representations. They're not real things. And my unconscious mind goes, oh, really? And I go, well, yeah. And it goes, okay. So how about if I punched you in the face as a representation of how I think you should be feeling right now? Would that be not feeling very real to you? Yeah. And I look like a crazy person because I'm thinking this in my mind, but I'm cracking up out loud just like you did. And I'm like, right, okay. So what is that representation doing? It's like it's translating between dimensions. So, and then that's what made me think of what a stop sign is.
Mm-hmm.
A stop sign is an interdimensional translator. So we've got this idea that we want to make traffic stop. So we've come up with a symbol that represents it in that subjective representational world. And what that does is that then you also tell people, hey, set up an educational system so that people learn what this symbol means and how to behave accordingly. And then every time you come across the symbol, that representation of that guy's initial idea, and then combining with the city planners who want people to stop and check that it's safe, look both ways before continuing driving. That is translating through time and space across their internal dimension of representation into the physical world through time and space, instantiated every time you rock up in front of it. And so it is a very real thing. It's just that reality that we live in happens to co-arise as a representational space, communication space, as well as the physical instantiation of it. And so that's what that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm saying meaning is the internal representation and all of its implications and how they arise and unfold in the temporal dimension.
Okay.
So it's a three-dimensional cross of internal representation, its actual implication, which is in the stop sign sense, it's stop your freaking car. It could be danger. And how that actually, if you freeze that and you don't think about it and unpack it temporally, you get the illusion that it is an illusion. You're like, oh, it's not real. Yeah, it's not real if you restrict it to just the physical dimension, just the internal dimension, or if you get rid of the concept of implications, or you get rid of time. Then yeah, that's how you make it not make sense. But that's just getting rid of meaning itself, which requires all of both the representation and the implication and how it unfolds through time.
Yeah, it sounds like so your rationality has divided statically, symbol, implication. And in doing that, like you said, it creates the illusion that these are two separate things that don't really exist and they kind of only exist either up here or down here. But in reality, there is an
Yeah.
experience that's happening. And in the
Yep.
experience is a dynamic flux where everything that has been divided by the rational thought of the binaries and the space between them is now being united into a
Yeah.
unified flow.
Well, what they do is even worse than that. They go implication, they go the physical, and they go forget time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like trying to understand music by just looking at a single note. I heard this song the other day. You know this one. Da. Yeah. It's like, well, do you want more of the notes? Like, what do you
Yeah.
want them for?
Very
So
anticlimactic.
yeah. So that a lot of free will doesn't exist arguments are spurious in that way. They're like things like if free will means you get to choose, but you only ever what but you'll only ever choose what you want, and even if you try and change your mind to want something different, you're still choosing what you want. Um, so where's the free will in that? Well, it's in the temporal realm of um, expanding it way beyond just like the choosing and the doing and the wanting and the way it unfolds and all of that is free will because it co-arises with the internal and the external. We're predictively processing, we're anticipating, we're emerging, and that's all happening as the possibility space, which is infinite, actualizes down into the choice point that you're making.
Mhm.
And that's all continuously unfolding temporally. And if you separate any of them out, it looks like you don't have free will, but of course you do.
Yeah, because you separated them statically. You're not seeing the
Yeah,
flux. It's
it doesn't work. It
they don't know
doesn't work.
anything.
It's like going that let's just listen to this first note of the symphony. Bah, it's not a very good symphony.
Yeah.
Next week, tune in and we'll
Yeah.
analyze the second note of the symphony and tell you how that's not very good either.
Yeah. That'll be the easiest mastering job you've ever done. Just one note. I can do it. Here, let me read you something because I think this is relevant to what you said. This is, of course,
Yep.
quote, this is not an opinion as to the value of the natural or, hold on, let me make sure. Okay. This is not an opinion as to the value of the natural or the lack of value of the artificial instruments. Yet he's talking about how originally the instruments of Let me see. What does he say? He says, at one time, man himself, or more precisely, the human body, was the instrument of sight or thought across distances. So he says, he's talking about whether technology, he says technology is a creation, trying to re-attain um, that sense of, Jesus, that instrumentation that we have for sight. Because as consciousness has complexified, we've realized we don't have the tools capable naturally to understand the world. But anyways, he says, this is not an opinion as to the value of the natural or the lack of value of the artificial instruments. Yet the very fact of the quantity, indeed the quantification of the constructed artifacts, could well cause us to reflect on the phenomenon even where we are speaking of valuable precision instruments. Detractors of such instruments will decry them as being substitutes. Defenders will point to their enhancement, and both will be able to marshal good arguments. But the conflict of opinion does not resolve the problem. It merely achieves the temporary triumph of one or the other. And then he says, here we go. Yet to the extent that the machine is an objectivization or an externalization of man's own capabilities, it is in psychological terms of projections. We have internal. We have already spoken of the decisive role of projection in the emergence of consciousness. It is only because of these projections which render externally visible the powers lying dormant within man that he is able, or more precisely, that it is possible for him to become aware of the intrinsic potentiality which is capable of being comprehended and directed. Here's the key part. Sorry, I read an extra paragraph I shouldn't have.
That's all right.
All quote unquote making, what's that?
Yep.
All quote unquote making, whether in the form of spellcasting or of the reason technical construction of a machine, is an externalization of inner powers or conditions, and as such, their visible outward form. Every tool, every instrument and machine is only a practical application of inherent laws, laws of one's own body rediscovered externally. All basic physical and mechanical laws, such as leverage, traction, bearing, adhesion, all constructions, such as the labyrinth, the vault, all such technical achievements or discoveries are pre-given in us. Every invention is primarily a rediscovery and an imitative construction of the organic and physiological pre-given symmetries or laws in man's structure, which can become conscious by being externally projected into a tool. And I think that totally hits with your notice how the internal and the external are not separate, opposite binary antitheticals. They condition and work with each other, like you were saying.
Yeah.
The external is just exactly that, an externalization of the internal, but the internal has nothing without external senses coming in. And it means nothing if we're not externalizing these things. So we can view them as two separate things, but it's important, as you say,
Yep.
to recognize the unity there and not get lost in deficient rationalism and thinking we're all, no, there's a unity underlying there. And I think that really hits what he would describe that as integrative thinking or integral thinking.
Yeah. So where the main difference appears to be is that he looks at things as distinct aspects that still have their distinct aspectual nature. Whereas this unitive conceptualization is more on the emergence embodied side of how they are all co-arising temporally as one. So it's like an inside out rather than an outside
Okay.
integration. It's an inside emergent unification with. And so it comes about from experientially being able to experience the unitive nature of reality prior to language, prior to, yet with still the same level of sophistication of engagement. So you're not losing anything, but you're experiencing directly the emergence or the what I was calling the event horizon. It's where the infinite and the finite manifest at the point that they're actualizing and potentiating into existence. That's what resolves the infinite and the finite. So the realm beyond the emergent present is an infinite realm. And the further you look out into the future, the more potentials there are. But when they condense down and actually become, so as they emerge within your experience of reality, they're not caused by anything. It's the natural emergent unfolding into finite form. And so one way of thinking of it is if I take a seed, and the seed's in a packet, the preconditions necessary for the seed to grow into a tree are not present. And all of the different potential forms of that species of tree are available inside, packed into this tiny seed. Let's say we're talking about an oak tree, right? And so the oak tree can mean, the seed, sorry, can mean all of those different oak trees, but it's only going to mean one of them. But it won't mean any of them while it sits in the shelf in a packet in the dark. And you could say that I get some soil and put it in a pot and put the seed in it and water it. And you could rationalize that there's some kind of causality there, but nothing's actually being caused. What's happening is the precondition necessary for that tree to emerge through time and all of the unitive principles that enable the emergence it formed through time, the precondition has changed, and now the preconditions necessary for the infinite unmanifest potential to manifest as a singular, finite, individuated tree are to happen through time. Does that, you still there?
Yeah, repeat. I missed the last 5 seconds there.
Okay. Yeah, my wife called. That's and I just had to hit
Got more important,
decline.
someone more important on the line here.
Yeah, so the preconditions change, and nothing is causing the tree, but the preconditions have changed for the emergence of the infinite possibility of all of those infinite shapes of tree to emerge into the actual individuated personal tree as it emerges and unfolds through time. And so there's no causality in that. There's just all of the principles, the universal principles that enable, via precondition, new emergence from an infinite space of potentiation and possibility to manifest into a singular, actualized, finite form. And so that's how the unmanifest infinite and the manifest finite resolve. It doesn't mean that if you get an infinite, if you get 1,000 monkeys, and I mean, it's a hypothetical non-reality, so they're kind of silly anyway. But what never made sense to me is the idea that this infinite monkeys would type out the works of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
I would have always thought, no, that's like saying if I stare at a television screen with static on it, at some point Seinfeld's going to come on, right? It's not.
Yeah.
You can stare at that. You can stare at that random background noise of the universe forever. It's never going to make Seinfeld. There has to be some form of individuation out for that to manifest as the actual finite potential. So infinity is non-existent potential, and the finite actual is the emergent.
And both rely on each
And
other.
that, yeah, they're mutually constitutive of each other, inseparable and unknowable by a separation. And and then this idea that I'm pointing to can be experientially lived from as the knowing of the space between the buildings and things. And I think that's the new form where where because the fun I was writing down a lot of the because what I try and do is I try and write simplify what the integral stuff says and then look at the differences between what I'm saying. And the three main differences I was coming up with was that um, the integrative still looks at how its distinct perspectives integrating together rather than co-arising and emerging. And they're not as bound and unitative. And I think what's happened is when he was writing this, I think this new structure that I'm talking about was actually emerging. And I think that I get the sense that he's conflating the two, that there's a conflation going on between the integrative and this actual new emergent conceptualization that is unitive and that has um, the perspectival subject to object, object to subject at the same time from both directions, arising as one. Because integrative is like let's take the subject like objective perspective and look at it from that direction, see how that works. Let's take the subjective perspective and look at how that works and how they can integrate together. This is let's look from both perspectives outwards at one another and inwards into each other from the emergence point at the same time comprehended all perspectival simultaneously as one. And that kind of shuts down the thinking part, which is why it has to be embodied,
Yeah, that's
right?
fascinating stuff. So you're saying causality, that's a hallmark of rational thought. So you're saying that's essentially just projected. What are really happening is this sort of underlying emerging or unfolding. And
Yeah,
what we call causality is just a particular stance of bringing objects in the world into relation with each other. So now
yeah,
we can do a different one.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
That's good
Because
stuff.
it all starts with trying to abstract out the world by explaining it, explaining everything from start the principle of laws of motion. If this bumps into this, that causes this, that causes this. And then let's try and make a theory of everything starting from that stance. That seems to be where it all comes from, and that's what leads you to all sorts of nonsense like there's no free will, you
Yes.
don't have any agency, and I know instead of God we can use the multiverse.
Yep. I was just about to say no
You know what I mean?
spirituality
Stuff
there.
like yeah, no, none of that stuff. Whereas yeah, I think I think it's just the wrong frame for trying to understand the nature of the emergent properties of reality.
I couldn't agree
And the
more.
reason that the reason I think it's potentially a new emergent structure is we're seeing all the hallmarks that he ticked off. That's why I really liked hearing about what Gibbs is saying, where he's like, look, it's changing in language, it's changing in like you've got like Einstein with space time and relativity, and you've got um like new these changes that happen in art and these changes that happen in all these kind of cultural changes and all of these kind of values changes and stuff. And I'm like, I was going, yeah, but we're seeing more and more of that again. So we're seeing instead of like stories now, we're seeing non-linear storytelling. It's perfectly acceptable to reboot Spider-Man multiple times
Yep.
and to have multiple emergent
Yeah, that's
Spider-Man,
true.
right?
Yeah.
Like we're seeing this like, and the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, and all of the obsession that everyone is now starting to have with the observer and measurement collapse of the wave function stuff, and it's making it into the zeitgeist and into art and things, and we're starting to see. You're starting to see more and more people who really deeply see the emergent properties um, of the co-constituency of us as nature. Or even the other day, I was listening to a new woman who's writing some stuff that's people are like, well, this is really cutting edge on the self, because she's saying you can't think of the self. All of the fundamentals have to be redone because we've always individuated out the self. When you emerge as a self, you're only a self with others, and there's has to be the self and the other at the same time. Because can you really have a self if you're not in relation with another? And it's all this kind of like, um, it it's different to just integrating different but totally separate essences that integrate together. It's seeing the co-emergence and co-arising of them from an internal outwards and an outwards inwards together at the same time.
Yeah.
Kind of a unitive
Right.
aspect. And I'm just really, and I was just struck by that and going, oh, I wonder if there is a new unconscious structure
Mhm.
that we can kind of really tap into. And it seems like I suspect there is. And because we're also seeing it in spiritual practices, we're seeing more and more people doing non-duality practices, which is like the gateway drug that eventually ends up in further and further experiential places, like where you do get this. Because when you do normal non-dual stuff, it doesn't end up lighting up your brain like you're on psychedelics, but it's like one of the stepping stones getting there. And there's more and more interest in this mindfulness, this non-duality thing. But eventually, where that actually leads is kind of classically called enlightenment in a lot of circles and things. But the other difference I wanted to kind of touch on, I know we're shooting off in different places here, but I wanted to bring this framework in because I think I've made this observation and I think it's very pertinent. And I think it kind of can maybe bring some more grounding to what I'm talking about with embodied. So I did a kind of analysis of all different spiritual practices. And I thought about it in terms of a 4-quadrant framework. And so in the framework, on one side, you have, so you write witnessing, uh, witnessing impersonal at the top, and then you write imminent, personal, divine at the other point on the top. Then on the side, you have um, um, uh, so it's witnessing. Oh no, sorry, witnessing, embodying, transcendent, impersonal, and imminent, personal, divine. So you got witnessing practices that witness the transcendent, impersonal aspect. They're kind of like Zen practices and stuff like that, where you go into this expanded state of awareness and you witness the impersonal nature of the transcendent reality of the universe. And then you've got embodying the transcendent aspect, which are more like types of practices like the Sufis do when they do all of their, like whirling dervishes and things like that, where you're doing embodied practices that also put you into this kind of embodiment of the transcendent and impersonal aspects. And there's a lot of practices that kind of do that as well. And then there's the witnessing of the personal, immanent, or divine aspect of reality. And that's more like the meditation practices that are like loving kindness meditation practices, and things where you're not embodying anything, you're not doing
Yeah.
um anything, but you're um you're kind of witnessing that nature, that personal nature, those that more like the classic example is those Buddhist monks who do the compassion, loving kindness meditations and things. And then there's very few practices that do this fourth quadrant, which is embodying the immanent, personal, divine aspect. And so those are the ones that you do get some of that in Christianity, where you've got, Christians doing like helping the poor and trying to embody these kind of loving kindness or personal aspects of their particular faith of what represents divinity and things. But there's something more and more powerful about, I think, going into that realm, and it's been very much overlooked. And it turns out that you kind of find that these days in positive psychology,
Yeah.
where it's like gratitude journaling and doing all of these like things that actually functionally improve all of the metrics of mental health and longevity and stuff. And they're not calling them spiritual, but those are actually spiritual.
Almost like
And
like
sorry.
stoicism. Do you think that would maybe almost count there?
Stoicism is an interesting one. So, if we look at the practicality of Stoicism, Stoicism is recognizing how you action Stoicism is you recognize that we are identificating systems where we are constantly, whenever we enter into any relationship, we have an identity spring up. And so um, rather than letting that just happen spontaneously of its own, we use our intellect and our will to choose the identity we wish to embody. And so, if that person was choosing, some kind of to instantiate and embody some kind of higher principle that is not like a selfish, just self-only thing, but to live according to some principle, that is very much more what I would call an immanent embodied practice of the immanent personal nature of the transcendent reality or God or divinity or whatever you want to call it, the arising fundamentals of nature that give forth to not just that bring chaos into order and bring flourishment and self-replenishment and all of that. And so the reason I bring it up is, interestingly enough, I've been able to develop some techniques that take people into that state and very successfully take people on walks where I ask them the question at the end of the walk. I'm like, so what's the difference between you and the lights on the horizon? Because I'll often do it on a really long, super flat beach. Or what's the distance between you and the lights on the horizon? Or what's the difference? And they'll be like, there is no distance, there is no difference, right? They're just like, everything is just all collapsed down into absolute unity. It's this beautiful, blissful, crazy place. But what happens is, if they haven't been doing enough positive psychology practices, they'll have a very high degree chance of flipping out afterwards. So I've taken a few, like one person just had a complete mental breakdown for about 2 years afterward. And then yeah, they rebuilt themselves and they recovered. Um, but yeah, it's very interesting, and it made me think, so there's actually two aspects to the kind of spiritual psyche, so to speak. There's the horizontal aspect, which is like honey to ants. That's the witnessing stuff. That's the transcendent states. People love to confuse those states for their own self, and they flock to that stuff. Like, ooh, here's some trippy stuff I can do, and like, wow, now I feel like I'm beyond all personal ego and personal consequences and stuff. And by actually mistaking yourself for that which you are witnessing, especially if you're witnessing the personal transcendent nature of divine love or something, you can mistake yourself for that which you're witnessing, um, and then come back and lead a really horrible sex cult or something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's where all of that falling down comes, because they're doing the Kevin Costner thing,
Mhm.
but to like divinity, or to the transcendent. And so there is as well as that, there's this vertical aspect, um which enables you, by practicing particular principles again and again and again, of like actually embodying loving kindness or embodying deep gratitude, even ahead of time, and even if it's things that you don't you don't like, but you rather than straying into negativity, you replace that negativity with an embodied practice of gratitude, and you do it not just internally, but you make sure that it's landing externally as well in some sort of form. If you're doing these kind of practices again and again and again, I think that's the vertical aspect of, or
Yeah.
the primary aspect of spirituality, where you are, where you, as we were talking about with Stoicism, beginning to create a model of conduct that allows you to live your highest level potential of identificating to of being and becoming one with, or being the virtue that you place your high ideal or value on.
Hmm.
And so doing that again and again and again lifts one's uh, character and one's identity. And I think that, yeah, I just think that's a very overlooked, but will become increasingly obvious and important as we move forward into what are going to be they're looking like very interesting and transitional times. I can really see a big collapse of meaning and place in the world and understanding, if these cognitive architecture AI systems, and then them being embodied in robots, are going to unfold according to the timeline projections that people are saying, it's going to be a very, very different world, and there's going to be a lot of people going, wow, I have too much time to think,
Right.
and not enough meaning in my life, and I can't rationalize my way out of this,
What do you think
if
of
that makes sense.
yeah, that was fascinating stuff. Are you familiar with postmodernity at all?
Postmodernism, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So it has I thought it was deficient rationalism. I brought this up with my talk with John because
yeah,
take Foucault seriously, right? If you took him seriously, you wouldn't take him seriously at all. But let's take him seriously. You are
yeah.
you're sectoring and dividing the individual a- away from all knowledge claims, right? And it also melts down. But I think this flattening that you're talking about that is present in postmodernity and flattens everything. There is no more hierarchy. There's no more this knowledge is better than the other. Everything is a social construct in lieu of power, and in turn, everything becomes equalized and I think flattened. Um, do you think
So
that's
when you're saying flattened, how are you relating that to what I'm talking about?
So when you hmm, maybe I chose the wrong example, but I re, re
No. But let's go down there because this might help with whatever the disconnect is.
so for rationally speaking, we could say science, knowledge produced by science is better, and we can place it on a hierarchy above knowledge produced by poetry because it's more empirical, it's more quantifiably measurable, conscious known, it's not subjective, yada yada yada.
Okay.
Postmodernity flattens
I,
all
I,
of it, you know.
yeah. So what I'm saying is there's for every hierarchy, there's an inverse hierarchy,
Okay.
and they co-create one another
Okay.
and they expand. So, so it's not you can't flatten hierarchies, but the more that it's like when you look at the discipline and the freedom, or the rights and the responsibilities, they are a hierarchy, and one is primary, and that one is the the prime one grows and expands by the other's capacity to increase. So discipline is the vertical aspect that expands, that confers. You could see it as a point pointing down, creating a triangle downwards. So the more discipline that you have as you go higher, the wider the base of freedoms that are available to you. But at the same time, the freedom that you choose to embody um, expands up and boosts up the capacity for that discipline to grow in that realm. So they both have a co-creating, interlocking, and expanding hierarchical structure. And so another way to think about it, let's think about it this way. Let's form you and me, let's form a rock band supergroup, right? And so we'll be up on stage. What we are, hierarchically, we're the primary, okay? And then the crowd or the audience, it's vastly bigger than us because we've managed to tell everyone we're a supergroup, right? Um, when we're practicing, we practice and we play, and no one's there, and so there's no potential, there's no energy. We're just making music, but it's not for anyone. We're not a supergroup yet. We're just practicing, and so along comes the audience, and if you and I play and we haven't practiced, we suck. That audience just like goes and they leave, right? But if we've got our stuff together and we've really nailed out some, like, you know, we've managed to put together a show like Daft Punk, say, or whatever, and we've attracted the right audience, the energy that the crowd feed us and the vibration and energy that we feed back into the crowd co-create and co-emerge together in that same structure that I was telling you about, and a amazing concert that is expands through time and people talk about 10 years later. That's how that emerges. So that's two interlocking, growing, and that the structures emerge and co-create and are co-constitutive of one another. They are hierarchical, and one feeds the other feeds it, and they're as they both achieve their full potential together, they expand outwards in value.
It almost
And
reminds
so
me of,
there's no,
oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
sorry,
It
yeah, go
almost
on.
reminds me of what Nietzsche was talking about with Greek tragedy, where you had the chorus on one hand, and then you had the actor, where the chorus was the Dionysian, and they would sing through essentially the individual actor, which who would act,
Mhm.
and then in turn would give them more information. So they kind of, like you were saying, they
Yeah.
co-created themselves. That's yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so you get rid of the actor and the singing's just annoying, and you get rid of the guy and he's just doing the pantomime.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry, you add the guy back and you get rid of
Yeah.
the singing group. It's got no music to it, so he's just like, ah.
Yeah.
It's there's this emergent, but there's always a primary, and um there's always a secondary, and they're united together and they're constitutive of one another, and they confer and infer one another, and they grow together. And you can take this temporal perspective where you see them as the expansion of potential emerging, actualizing, and achieving full potential.
Okay.
And that's a and to me that's kind of a different it's a both a unitive singular perspective and and a aspectual perspectival at the same time.
Okay. I
So
see.
it's integrative and something more. It's unitive and integrative,
Okay.
because I can see all the integrative aspects, but I'm seeing the whole thing as one at the same time as the whole thing, and that's the whole not two. But so with my description of the audience of the concert, I'm seeing the supergroup and the audience as not two but one, to expand to create, but they're also not one thing, they're still two. And so it's that unitive aspect of all aspects
Okay.
and how they unfold through time.
I'm pretty sure if a rationalist
And
was talking about this, he'd accuse us of schizophrenia. So that's good. They always say if you start doing the unified theory of life, you're schizophrenic. So that's always nice.
yeah, possibly, yeah. I mean, to me, it's hard. I actually have to try and think not like this to remind myself how to think in the other way. So it's quite interesting. But the reason that I talk about it, and the reason that I think it's important, everything that I do, whatever I'm writing, whatever I'm learning, what I'm passionate about, is not philosophy. I'm not particularly interested in untestable ideas that are articulated well. I'm 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 actually very, very much interested in um, things that we can definitely leverage.
Mhm.
So that's what brings me back to describing these as principles. So if you understand that the principle, if you can cleanly articulate the principle that as you expand your discipline and go up in your capacity through discipline to absolutely nail something really, really well, your your freedom around that thing expands and confers the growth of the discipline at the same time. If you understand that, then you can actually apply that to yourself. And so that's the way I look at all of these things is they're not just, I'm always looking at what are the underlying principles and how can they be actioned upon and leveraged.
Mhm.
So that gives my inquiry into the nature of reality, it always has to be testable. And that gives it a testability
Mhm.
where I'm like, does this apply to myself and others? And are there things that I can take from this where if I apply them to myself, they're good for me now and good for me now and others now and good for me in the future and others in the future. That classic ecology check. So I'm fascinated by, and I'm always trying to look for the principles that enable humankind's flourishment with the ability to transcend these seeming nonsense divisions, find common value, and achieve a state. Everything I'm trying to write and trying to do is ultimately around articulating the principles that will enable humankind to unite together in a cooperative competition of um, like a rich tapestry of cultures and values and things, rather than an adversarial competition. And so I believe that this whole realm of integrative thinking and then unitative thinking and the very stuff that we're talking about can help to unpack and articulate the principles that enable that. Whereas they've been very not present in the with the kind of primacy of rationalism. And I think that's the stuff that Jordan Peterson, for example, is trying to get Sam Harris to connect with. It's like
Don't get me
you
started.
you yeah, well, you know what I mean? That the gap is, sure, you want to tear down a monotheistic structure and based on undermining all of its flaws and things, but you're not wanting to examine your own flaws, and you're also not providing a much better and richer solution.
And they're
And
misunderstanding.
so,
They're taking a rational analysis to mythology. It's just like,
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's even that take.
yeah.
That's even that's. I mean, that's even just. I think that's further than Jordan's even trying to do. He's trying to go. He's trying to go. Look, there's a little bit. If you have just a little, extend a little bit of an olive branch, you can probably find that there's actual values being articulated and conferred here, and they'll help your science. Because when you practice the science, if it's not underpinned by any human value, it can go to freaking crazy places
Yeah.
where we undermine the kind of continuation of our species and stuff.
Yeah.
But I suppose the place I'm coming from is I really want to unpack and uncover the positive embodied personal aspects of that are inside the nature, the very existent universal principles that are mirrored in nature,
Mhm.
and articulate them in a way where we can embody them and practice them and get better and better at them, so that we can get into a position or a space that truly is, well, the way a rainforest just keeps going, the way everything, like, I mean, we live in this universe of
Mhm.
superabundance. Like, food grows itself,
Yeah.
and trees wash themselves by producing the very, like, precipitation that is necessary. And, like, everything, life life emerges in complexity, and in harmony, in this beautiful balance of perfectly imperfectly perfect.
Mhm.
And everything is very toroidal in nature.
Yeah.
um, and we can be like that too.
Yeah.
And we actually have the capacity to uncover the kind of gaps in our thinking and in our identificating, and to embody more and more structures and behaviors and ways of being that enable and instantiate that. Yeah, which is, yeah,
We'd be fully human too. We wouldn't just be mythical, magical, or even just, I guess unitive is a little different. But we could use all the aspects of what makes the human condition, all aspects of the human condition, and we can use them
yeah,
fortuitously, you know?
yeah. Well, what we've done is we've started as these. Um, that was the distinction I thought of the other day that I wanted to point out. Um, the difference is, what's it, going back to the archaic, where there was a really good word that described the difference between what I'm talking about. Um, so when you start out when you're a baby, the reality is just like this indistinct. It's undifferentiated.
Differentiated. There it is. Yeah.
Right. So the unitive is not going back to being undifferentiated.
Hmm.
That's the big difference. It's not undifferentiated. It's the unitive that it's uniting all the differentiation.
Yeah.
That's the difference I'm pointing to.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
think that's good. Whether
And
it's
so,
yours or integral, it's going that way. It's going towards a unifying way. And I think
oh
you see
yeah,
this on the
everything.
internet.
Yeah.
Well, the book, Take the Gutenberg printing press. What
Yeah.
Marshall McLuhan will tell you was that caused essentially what we're talking about, the mental consciousness structure. Not really. It was really the mental consciousness structure. But the point is, the book is not only a propagator of the new consciousness structure, but an embodiment of it because all the tenets of rational thought, this sort of logical one after the other, individual,
Yeah.
a lot of no noise, which allows time and space for deep thought. It sort of propagates and embodies it. And then the internet has been so game changing that
Yeah.
and it does have this unifying function. You can, um, I mean, you can talk, you can listen, you can play games, you can do anything on the internet. It sort of takes
Yeah.
all the medium of the past and combines it, unifies it. So
Yeah. It's a unity of an emergent structure, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
it's picking up the pieces of what rationality has divided up, and I think it's like, all right, let's get some unity again. Let's.
Yeah. 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 And so what I'm talking about is not going back to. So when I take people on that beach walk and we do the dialectic exercises that take you into this state, um, the that's not going back to an undifferentiated state. It's not returning to the archaic.
Yeah, yeah, it's
It is,
transcendent. Yeah,
yeah, it's transcending. It's unifying all of them into the immediacy of the now. And so, and it's very it's not even very hard to do because it's an inverted flow state.
yeah, yeah.
People just need to muck around with people just need to muck around with it after they've elevated their heart so that they've got incredible positive affect so that when when everything kind of um unifies down to this no differentiation but not undifferentiated.
Right. Yeah.
When it's like beyond time, beyond space, beyond separation, but containing but the emergent place from which all that emerges,
Mhm.
that they don't have a terrible time afterwards.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like the way with the flow state, the way you collapse your conscious focus down onto I'm just freaking doing this one thing. And you could say in that flow state, if I briefly pulled you out of it, I don't know what you do, but let's say it's a sport or something. If you're like surfing a wave, you're not thinking about yourself and you're not thinking about time. And so that is very similar, no time, no self kind of thing. But it's becoming hyper focused on like a singular. And with the thing that I do, it's just expanding your awareness whilst noting the awareness and experiencing more awareness behind everything. So you walk, you look at all of the things, you hear everything at once, you feel all of the textures at once, and you then describe the describe the direct experience of the awareness itself,
Yeah.
not the contents of awareness. And you just keep describing it and describing it, and it has this expanding effect where very quickly you're so entranced into awareness that um, you're not thinking of yourself in time or in space or as separate or whatever. But instead of with the flow state, it only goes to there, like to absolute focus. With the expanded awareness, within like 20 minutes, you'll hit a place where you're like, start saying things like awareness is um, both contains all and is beyond all. Um, awareness is the now that all is passing through. You'll start describing it, and you're literally describing the aspects of awareness as the awareness is being arising. But you'll find it just keeps going infinitely.
Mhm.
And so after 2 hours of that, far out, very far out. Excuse me.
No, no
Let
problem.
me clear my throat for a sec. I'm still recovering from that cold.
No problem. I might have
Oh.
to cut it short here soon, my friend.
No, that's all right. We're probably coming to the end anyway. My battery's almost flat. But yeah, fantastic.
Yeah,
Thanks
if
for
you,
talking and yeah, I'm really enjoying what you're doing and hearing like I haven't read his book. What I've been doing is I've been finding the bits that you're talking about and condensing them and kind of clarifying them and then looking for the differences.
yeah.
But I found it particularly intriguing because I was like, as I told you before we started recording, I've been looking at all of the guys that have been looking at his stuff and building stuff after it. And I was like, so this is who they're all getting it from, and they're just not referencing him. So that's spiral dynamics, and I assume that's where Ken Wilber and the integral theory and integral movement and all those guys are getting their stuff from,
Mhm.
and they're all inspired by him. And so it's not, yeah. So because I've read a lot of that later stage posts, I guess Gibbs's stuff. That's why, like when I read it, I'm like, yeah, I get this because I've already been thinking a
Yeah.
lot about that because I've been exposed to heaps of that. Yeah,
Debster does a great
which
job allowing you to directly engage with things that you were kind of indirectly intuiting or noticing. Like people,
yeah,
I know
yeah,
people use rationalism and I hear them say it and I hear what they're going for. They just don't have the tools directly to deal with it.
yeah.
Like very specifically bring it in. Like this is how object, boom, boom. They kind of have a vague idea of it and they know it's ending, but they don't really know what's next.
Like I also love the way that he's gone and found root word etymology and found all of these historical examples, and there's a real depth to it, and it makes me way more. It's a lot deeper because you can see how he's kind of codified and uncovered it, and it's coming at it from lots and lots of different disparate places that have an incredible amount of explanatory power when you bring them together like that. So yeah, and that's what's made me go, if we look at all of those things that he's pointing to say, check out these all point to a structure,
Yeah.
then if we do that now, it really does seem like there's a new structure coming.
Yeah. Even little
That's
words.
exciting.
Yeah, even just little words like, or even like when the switch from the unperspectable world to the perspectable world, the switch from writing right to left to now left to right. I would
Yeah,
see that
that's
and just
crazy though.
walk over it. I would just walk over that. It would be nothing. I wouldn't even, but he sees, no, this is
Yeah,
a powerful shift
yeah,
here. Yeah, it's great stuff.
yeah. And now we're writing in code,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
right.
we're writing code that writes itself. And now we're writing machines that make language that writes itself and that can talk back to you and that you can freaking argue with.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy.
Yeah.
that's that is such a different structure there. You know what I mean? So yeah. So I really wanted. I'm really glad that you reached out back and we could
Yeah.
have this conversation. I hope we have more.
I would,
And
anytime you want to, we can touch base. Shit.
Yeah, man. Likewise, likewise. And I really like the idea of trying to spot the new emergent structure and codify it as it's happening. I don't think because that hasn't been done before, and I think that has the that really I feel has a real potential to help the world.
Listen to this.
And
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you. Sorry. Uh,
no, go for it.
John David Ebert, who I mentioned, he's on YouTube. I would highly recommend checking him out. If anything, take his course on transformations of consciousness through time. That's what put me on to Gebser. You'll learn of Rudolf Steiner, Teilhard de
Yeah,
Chardin, Sri Aurobindo. These guys have really, really interesting theories. But he wrote this at the end of his
yeah,
book, The New Media Invasion. He said, he's talking about how on Facebook, we are flattened, right? You're a real 3D human person, but on Facebook, you
yeah,
become a flat avatar image. He says, but of course, all this is part of a larger endeavor of our civilization to flatten out depths into surfaces, to crush complexity, ambiguity, and multidimensionality into simplicity and advertising logo simple-mindedness. Television flattens political issues into sound bites. The automobile flattens cities into wastelands. Celebrities are a flattening of the human person into an icon. Hollywood movies flatten complex stories into formulas and cliches. Books are becoming ever more and more shallow. Zero casualty wars, caffeine-free coffee, Coke and Pepsi, non-alcoholic beer, all is flattened, simplified, detoxified, and destroyed. And I think that's what the flattening is that new structure coming through. But
right. Interesting.
yeah,
Or would that be the shadow aspect?
it's
Does
potentially
that sound Yeah, because that sounds like that's all a negative or a downside. So what that sounds like to me is the actual shadow limitation that we're going to burst through using the actual upside of a new structure to overcome.
yeah,
So, because I think we're reaching a deadlock or a limitation. That really summarizes all of these different things that are pointing to this kind of deadlock
yeah,
of limit,
yeah,
where I'm beginning to think that embodying and articulating universal principles and having that being highly valued in the zeitgeist and in how we live will be the antidote to these.
I think so too.
And that seems to be simultaneously arising because notice that long form discussions are more and more popular, and people are more and more into finding meaning, and there's kind of this antidote
Hmm.
that's arising at the same time as this extreme ultra flattening out, ultra simplifying, and ultra superficiality that's happening.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you've got this emerging. Yeah. Anyway, it looks like you need to go. Thanks so
Uh,
much.
no problem. If you think about the flattening, if you want to talk again, please. Is there anything you wanted to shout out or?
No, 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 not at all. Yeah,
Cool,
yeah.
man.
Let's talk again soon. That was fantastic.
That was awesome. I had a great
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Have a great
Looking
rest
forward
of
to
your
you.
day.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to your next section on his
Mental
book.
structure.
Uh,
Yes, sir. I'll
I
be there.
appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy.
All
Have a
right,
good
thank
one.